summer in the North Hemisphere, but today we're traveling to close to the summer again to Argentina. Well, as you know, this is a series of seminars with colleagues from other institutions who are working on research fields related to Equality Labs work. And the aim of this seminar is to get closer to these researchers and their groups and to exchange our views with them to stimulate our collaboration network. And today we are welcoming Elisa Belfiori, professor in the School of Business of Universidad Torcuato Di Tella from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Hi, Elisa, and welcome.
Hello, Manuel.
How are you?
I'm very happy to be here.
Well, me too. And many thanks for joining us today. Before giving the floor to Elisa, just a brief summary about her work and experience. She's a macroeconomist with interest in climate economics and public finance. Elisa holds a PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota, and her research focuses on the optimal design of climate policies and sits at the intersection of macroeconomics and climate change with application from public finances. Today, she will be speaking about climate macroeconomics and optimal policy design. In the talk, we will discuss optimal climate policy, applying modern macroeconomics and public financial tools, and we will study how climate policy interacts with traditional fiscal policy using macroclimate models of the global economy as a framework. And also, we will learn how to add intergenerational equity considerations to the optimal climate policy design problem. Just a comment about the planning. Elisa will give us a presentation of about 15-20 minutes, and after that we will open the discussion. So feel free to share your comments, raising your hand and speaking, or also writing in the chat. Just I want to ask you to switch off your cameras and mute your microphones so we can see Elisa and her presentation. And I also want to remind you that we will record the session and will be shared to you in the next few days. That's all, Elisa. I give you the floor, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Manuel, and thanks everybody for being here and for having me and this opportunity to talk about my work. So as Manuel said, I am a macroeconomist, and it's good to say that because I work on climate economics, but I feel like what I know the most is macro tools and public finance tools on optimal policy design that I apply to the climate problem. I did my PhD in Minnesota, and I work as a tenure-track professor at Colorado State University for 4 years, and I am back in Argentina since 2017. And I am in Di Tella since 2020. So I'm still adjusting to be back at home, but very happy. And it's always being in Argentina so far away. It's always a challenge to find collaboration with other people and just to be in touch with the rest of the world. So this opportunity for me is very important. I'm very happy to be here. What I did is I'm going to share my presentation. And I'm not going to present any paper in particular, but I'm going to give you like a bit of a summary of all the things that I do so that you can see whether some of it or all of it is of your interest, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about it. So it's going to be on climate, macroeconomics, and policy design, which are the three things that I know the most. And maybe the other thing that I would mention is that when I was here in Argentina before my PhD, I worked as a research assistant in the Central Bank of Argentina. So I'm very keen of monetary economics and policy design because of that experience too. I also worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. So that is a part of me which is not showing in my research right now, like the monetary policy taste, but it's something that is in there too. So I think we said all of this. This is me. I use tools from modern macro and public finance to study optimal policy design and in particular climate policy. So I started here with some of my publications. This is my work, and I would divide my work in two main contributions so far. My job market paper and some of the papers on my early work when I graduated from my PhD had to do with how to add equity goals to the policy design problem. You know that as a policymaker, you usually have many goals. Some of them have to do with efficiency, and some of them have to do with equity and maybe, like inequality in the society. So in particular for climate change, there is a, well, I know I wanted to mention this because I know you care about, well, your name is equal C, right? So the part of equity that I worked on was intergenerational equity, and how can we design climate policies, in particular a carbon tax. When we talk about controlling carbon emissions that generate climate change, the optimal policy tool is a carbon tax. And so one of the questions I worked in some of my early papers, maybe the 2 or 3 that you see at the bottom of this list, is how do you need to change this optimal carbon tax to add an intergenerational equity goal. And I say I'm going to talk, and the other set, before I go in detail into that, the other set of work, which is my earliest work, like the one that I'm doing now, has to do with the interaction between climate policy and fiscal policy. Just because the optimal tool to deal with climate change is a tax, a carbon tax, then there is a close interaction between climate policy and fiscal policy. Thinking about fiscal policy, all the other traditional taxes that a government has, like a consumption tax, energy taxes, labor income taxes, capital income taxes. And so I have worked a little bit about how the carbon tax interacts with all of those other taxes that already exist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too. So this is a summary of my paper on carbon pricing, carbon sequestration, and social discounting, which is published in the European Economic Review. And this, I would say, is my most important contribution so far to the literature, and has to do with how to add an equity goal to the optimal climate policy design. And what I show in that paper is that there is a mapping between, if you think about you as a social planner or a government that wants to design a policy taking into account not only the welfare of the current generation, but also of all the generations that come after, then you can find that there is a mapping between setting welfare weights. This is how much I care about you today, how much I care about your kids and your grandkids as a policymaker. There is a mapping on that, my welfare weight on the different generations, and the social discount rate that I use to design the climate policy. So the main contribution of this paper is to show formally that there is a mapping between the welfare weight on future generations and social discounting. And in particular, if I care about future generations, I should use a low social discount rate to design the policy. But also the second step is to show that having a low social discount rate, and probably you heard this discussion about the Stern review back in time that was arguing that the social discount rate in climate policy should be low. The social discount factor, should be low. Then if we do that, there is a mapping between doing that and what is the optimal policy. So in particular, what I show is that if we only care about the current generation, then the optimal policy is going to be a carbon tax. But if I also care about future generations, then only having a carbon tax is not going to be sufficient to implement both the efficiency and the equity goal in the economy. And so I explore all the policies that are optimal in that setup, in one in which I care about future generations. And I find, for example, that it is optimal to set a cap on carbon offsets. These are the offsets that companies can use to comply within a carbon trading system. And so I find that an optimal policy when I have a goal on intergenerational equity is to have a cap on how much companies can use those carbon offsets. I also find that it is optimal to keep oil underground, and so a tool to do that will be a subsidy on for companies to keep oil reserves unexploited. And I play around with different policies, and I show like this is a theoretical paper that shows in different propositions which are the different policies that would internalize not only the climate externality but also this efficiency goal. So I guess the contribution is to work with intergenerational equity in a formal way, being careful to follow into the policy design what are the implications, the policy implications of having these kind of goals in the government policy. Recently, I have also got into more policy discussions and written some policy reports. And I would say that the one that I liked the most is my contribution to a book that was published by CEPR. Maybe you know this place, which is called, the book is called No-Brainers, a Low-Hanging Fruit in National Climate Policy. And what they asked to different economists around the world, like one per country, and I think we were 18 countries that are in this book. They asked us to write which are the most obvious things that we can do in terms of climate policy in each of our countries. So I wrote the chapter for Argentina, which is chapter 1. And so that would be, this would not be research like for a journal, but it's, I guess, like a nice analysis of the situation in Argentina and which kind of policies are relevant for us. And I think one of the main points that I make there is that maybe it's not obvious for like developing countries that we should get into climate policy because we are small, because we don't have the historical responsibility on the carbon emissions that is already in the atmosphere. But even taking all that into consideration, I find that, or I think that is a no-brainer that Argentina should get into climate policy. And the reason is that more and more I see climate policy as a kind of a trade policy. And to me, not getting involved as a country in climate policy will lead into kind of a global default, like countries will leave out of international markets those countries that don't contribute enough to climate policy. And that's where I think negotiations are going in terms of the carbon tariff. And I think in Europe, you are implementing some of this. So that was part of the point in this chapter. And also I talked a lot about agriculture and how I feel like also a low-hanging fruit for Argentina is to do climate policy through natural-based solutions in agriculture and livestock management. So that is some of my recent work too, which is more policy-oriented. And my working papers right now, I have a nice paper which is on these interactions between fiscal policy and climate policy. And if I have time, I will tell you a little bit more in detail. This is a paper with Armand Rizai. He is a professor in WU Vienna. And then I have a new research agenda that is focusing on the interaction between inequality and climate policy. But here it would not be inequality in terms of intergenerational inequality, but more about social inequality, like income inequality within the society and income inequality among different countries. What are the implications for climate policy of having low-income countries, high-income countries, and then low-income individuals within a country too. So I have a recent paper with Manuel Macera, which is a professor here, who is a professor here in Torquato di Tella, and I'm trying to push a couple of projects on this topic too, on income inequality and climate change. So one question that I usually get is like, why do I study optimal climate policy? It's kind of an illusion to think that we can get to the optimal result, and we know at this point we know that the optimal solution and something that would solve the climate change problem is to have a carbon tax which is implemented along by all the countries in the world. It has to be the same tax, and it has to be implemented in every country. And we have seen, so we know that that is the solution. That's a Pigouvian tax, but we also see that we've been going through many attempts to implement that, and we still have not been able to do it. If we look at all the carbon taxes that are in place, some are at the national level and some are at regional level, and there are some carbon trading systems. The European one would be the most important one at this point. Like only 21% of the carbon emissions that lead to climate change are regulated, are like subject to a carbon price today. And so to me, it feels like we are making progress, and each year it feels like, okay, we are moving in the right direction, but we are never there. And if we look at the carbon in the atmosphere, like the first time I looked at this picture, this is the carbon in the atmosphere measured at the Mauna Loa. Probably you are familiar with this picture. And the first time I saw this, I was a grad student, and I thought at that point, okay, this probably is gonna slow down, and eventually it's gonna move back, move down. And then year after year, I keep like updating the information, and carbon emissions and the carbon stock is always going up. And so sometimes it feels that because we are trying alternative things, we are trying like a promotion of renewable energy, for example, that would be like many countries today have some kind of subsidies to renewable energy. And it seems that, okay, we are moving in the right direction, but at the end of the day, if the goal is to have the carbon stock in the atmosphere under control, we see that we have done nothing so far. It's always going up. And so if we go into second best policies, I could just study second best policies, renewable subsidies, policies to promote carbon sequestration, just to use a different tax, fuel taxes. In some countries, like in Argentina, for example, the carbon tax is implemented as a tax on fuel. The problem is that there are many distortions that arise, and we are never clear, like if we are indeed moving in the right direction until we look at the data and we see that actually we are not moving in the right direction. Like carbon emissions keep increasing, even though we have 20 years of history of trying to do some climate policy, like year after year in every country. And so that's why I insist on optimal climate policy. And to me, it is informative to kind of know what is the best, and what is the first best, and that should be our goal. And then we can try to move, but we need to be clear on what is the first best. And that will be, all of my papers are talking about that ideal scenario in a way. So I know that not all the audience are economists, so I'm gonna just give a brief framework on what would be the general framework in all my work. I work with these models that are called integrated assessment models in the spirit of the work pioneered by Nordhaus, which has as a baseline a neoclassical growth model, like a solo model that you study like an intermediate macro course in grad school. And so that will be like the general framework in which I study all the questions, all my research questions. And this is a model that integrates a macro model, which will be what I learned in Minnesota, with a climate system, where in this climate system, you have many elements that are coming from outside economics, and it has elements from physics, chemistry, and I guess that is the big challenge, to integrate those elements that we are not familiar with as economists into a macroeconomic model. But I guess that is the work that Nordhaus did, and And now we can build on his work, and that makes things easy. So the elements that we add to the standard neoclassical growth model is a carbon cycle that shows how the economic activity, usually burning fossil fuels, using energy to produce a good, turns into atmospheric carbon. So that blue line that I was showing you before. So that's the first element that shows up in the model. There is also then some climate dynamics that is built in the model that shows how the presence of carbon in the atmosphere turns into an increase in global temperature. And then there is the feedback to the economy that says how this increase in global temperature generates an economic loss in the economy. That usually is modeled as an output loss, or it can be like a welfare loss in the economy. Okay, so the cycle starts from the economy. The economic activity leads to carbon in the atmosphere. That goes to an increase in temperature and comes back as a loss in the economy that takes the form of an output loss. And this will be like the general framework. It will look like, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but usually you have a welfare function. This is, by the way, a model of the global economy. And so we can think that what we want to do as a policymaker is to maximize social welfare. And this would be what you see as an objective. And then you can, and what makes people happy is to consume. And usually we consume out of goods that are produced out of capital and labor. But we extend this to say, okay, in order to consume, which is what makes us happy, we need capital, which is K, we need labor, which is N, and then we need to use energy. And that is where the problem starts. In order to use energy to produce consumption, which is what makes us happy, energy is going to build into something outside the economy, which is carbon in the atmosphere, which is this capital S. And so this energy that we use increases carbon in the atmosphere S, and then carbon accumulates over time. And there is this gamma, which is the natural rate of carbon absorption. And what we know is that this natural rate in which carbon is decaying over time is really low, what can make it naturally, right? And so that will be the first part of the cycle. And then how this carbon gets back into the economy, we model that as an externality, right? And so this function X tells us what is the fraction of output. Output is produced out of capital, labor, and energy. And then there is a fraction X of that output that is lost because there is an increase in temperature. And this would be like the framework that we use to analyze the climate change and climate policy. So what you can get if you put this model in a computer, you can get what is the path of carbon in the atmosphere that maximizes social welfare. So sometimes we say, okay, we need to cut carbon emissions to zero, and that is not actually true. I mean, it's going to be eventually true, but there is a path of optimal carbon that it is optimal because we need to pollute in order to produce, and produce is good for society, and consumption is good for society, right? And so we can get this optimal path of carbon emissions over time, and these are models that usually we solve it for a long time path, maybe 100 years or so. And so this optimal path is going to be the one that balance the social cost of using energy and generating climate change with the benefits of doing so, where the benefit is that we need to do that in order to consume, right? And so there is an optimal amount of emissions that actually balance the social and the social cost and benefits. And that is what we get out of these integrated assessment models. here, that cost of carbon emissions is called the social cost of carbon, and maybe you have heard this. This will be the key element of these models that we want to calculate. So what is the social cost of carbon? Because that is going to be a one-to-one mapping to that and the carbon tax. So the optimal carbon tax must be equal to the social cost of carbon. So I want to wrap up my talk with a brief discussion on this, my current research. And this is the paper that I talked about with Armon Rezai. And here what we do is we want to still do optimal policy, but we want to acknowledge that we see that governments are kind of reluctant to introduce a carbon tax. So we know that the carbon tax would solve the problem, but we also see, kind of in a positive way, like looking at the world, that governments around the world and policymakers are reluctant to use a carbon tax. And they tend to use other tools like renewable subsidies or fuel taxes. And so the research question of this paper is, can we still do optimal policy, right? So not going into a second best. Can we do optimal policy without using a carbon tax and just using other tools that already exist? And so what we do is we set up a model where the government has consumption taxes, energy taxes, labor income taxes, capital income taxes, renewable subsidies, all taxes that already exist in most of the countries. And we want to ask if there is a combination of all of them that actually can replicate exactly what a carbon tax does. And the main finding is that actually, yes, you can do that. The paper's main result is that a combination of existing taxes does as well as the carbon tax and implements the optimal solution in the society. Now, this combination is going to include like a portfolio, like, you know, in policymakers, sometimes they call this like a green package, like a combination of tools that have the goal of controlling carbon emissions. So this green package will include energy taxes, consumption taxes, income taxes, and a renewable energy subsidy. And so we characterize what are the optimal tax rates, and we do a numerical exercise to estimate whether we get reasonable tax rates. I mean, we can say, yes, we can replicate a carbon tax using consumption taxes, but if I get that the consumption tax that I need is to have, I don't know, a consumption tax of 150%, then it's not reasonable, right? So what we get in the numerical exercise is that these tax rates are within existing tax rate in terms of the tax rate. And so I'm just finishing up with these 3 lessons for policymakers that come out of the paper. And I didn't go over the paper in detail. So I guess what I wanted to communicate here is that in most of my work, what you are going to find is that sometimes they are like very theory-based, and I have a taste for doing theoretical points, clear points, in a theoretical model. But my ultimate goal is always to find policy implications and to try to be informative for policymakers and try to contribute to the work in that way. And so we translate the findings in the paper into 3 lessons for policymakers. The first one is that governments can prescind from a carbon tax and do climate policy with existing taxes. This is not obvious because we are saying, okay, we want to do optimal policy without having a tax on a missing market, which is a market for carbon emissions, right? But we show that then if the governments want to go ahead and do climate policy without a carbon tax, they can do it and just use existing taxes. Now, the second insight will be that it takes several taxes to reproduce the effect of a single carbon tax. And so we will need kind of a green fiscal package that combines many taxes. And in our model, it was like, in our paper, it was 5 taxes to replicate the one carbon tax that you would need in the optimal policy. And the third insight is a little bit more conceptual, I would say, which is sometimes governments, I mean, if we think about doing climate policy using existing taxes, we also need to acknowledge that existing taxes are used by governments to raise revenues. And so if they are using them, if they need them to raise revenue, is it possible to also use them to fix an externality? And this combines like Pigubian and Ramsey components in the tax rate. But again, we find that yes, you can do that. So I will finish here. I just wanted to share with you that we organize a workshop every year at the Catholic University. That is a workshop on environmental economics and climate change. This workshop is to disseminate the studies related to environmental economics and climate change with a focus on Argentina and Latin America, but I just wanted to mention this. This is how I met Sebastian like a year before, I think. But if eventually you find that there is something that you want to present, we usually do the workshop in person, but we are adding some virtual talks too. So I will be very happy to have some of you or many of you in these workshops in the upcoming events. And also, maybe you have seen this book that came out of the first workshop that we did. We wrote with Mariano. Mariano is a friend of mine, and he works as a researcher at the Catholic University. And what we did in the first edition of the workshop is we put together all the contributions, and we wrote this book on the economics of climate change in Argentina, which are papers by Argentinian researchers on topics related to climate change. And so we are proud of this product, and I just wanted to share it with you too, kind of so you have a sense of everything that I do here. I'm gonna finish my talk so that we have a chance to chat a little bit and you can ask me questions.
Well, many thanks, Elisa, for sharing with us your research, your findings, and recommendation for policymakers and all the things. It's been such an interesting presentation. And now it's time for sharing comments and ideas. So turn on your cameras if you wish. And I guess some of you wrote some questions in the chat, so we can start with that. First, Pablo, that commented that he would imagine that after working in monetary policy in Argentina, the remaining career will be like soft stuff.
Yeah, I needed a way out of that. So I just said, well, you know, I just, climate change is, sometimes I see it a different way. Like I live in Argentina and I also study climate change. So it's like everything that I look at is kind of stressful.
Yeah, and after that, there is a question from Sophia. She said, were the no-brainers and low-hanging fruits also non-controversial policy options? I don't know if you can see the chat.
Yes, I see the non-controversial. So what they asked us, the editors asked the contributors to kind of rank the policies in terms of which are the most obvious steps and like no-brainers in each country, but also like with some qualification on the political feasibility of those options. And so, like at least in my chapter in Argentina, there was kind of a ranking of which are the things that it seems most obvious from an efficiency economic perspective, and adding some comments on whether they are feasible politically or not. And I would say nothing is like a very low hanging, right? So we need to pay a cost. and that's for sure.
Well, and another question from Pablo. He said, I find that most people are highly disconnected and aware from government taxes applied to revert climate change, like those applied to carbon releases. This would prevent public support for stronger, more effective policies. What could be done to revert this social disconnection from these policies and from other policies aimed to sustainable exploitation of natural resources and nature conservation?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and comment. Sometimes I see it this way, and sometimes I see like now in Argentina there is kind of after the pandemic, I would say, like after COVID, it's like people realize that these global shocks can affect us. And so there is a sense that, okay, something like a climate shock or a climate problem at a global level can actually affect my everyday life. And so in a way, people got more aware of that at least. And I feel like if you talk to people, they are willing to do things, and they say, okay, yeah, I want to recycle, and I will try to bike. But then when it gets to, okay, let's put a price on that, and then that preference doesn't translate into, yeah, I'm willing to pay for it too. And to the point that sometimes, like, you need to clean, like at least here in Argentina, you need to clean the things in order before putting the bottle to recycle. And many people don't recycle just because they don't want to wash the thing. So imagine if you actually have to pay for it, right? And so there is, I guess, a lot to be done in that area too, but I think economists are not the best to talk to people. So I try to do that in my research. Like that's why I showed that the last slides was, I always try to somehow bring all the findings back to like a natural and a common, some message that my father can understand or my brother. But usually I think that's a problem for the economics profession, that we are not good at communicating like in a plain language the findings that we have.
Thank you. We have more comments here. Sophia says the carbon graph reminds me of the graph of overexploited fish stocks, 30 years of policy efforts, that the graph stays the same. And Milena also commented that she's agree with Pablo. How many of us know about or understand the EU CO2 emissions trading system in place since 2005? And we have another question from Sophia. She said it would be nice to hear more about the new inequality work. Is it also conceptual, uses the integrated assessment framework, or is it a different approach?
All right. Well, so the first time, and I guess my only time that I heard about fishing and the fishing stock was Sebastian, like talking in the workshop. And I found that connection too. I said, okay, so why, I guess there should be like an optimal policy in that problem. And I remember we chat a little bit about that during his presentation. So I don't know this graph that you are seeing, Sophia, but I'll be happy to see it too. Like, and maybe think about that problem too. And probably I'll say if overexploitation continues, is because the optimal policy has not been put in place just yet. And so it seems that we are doing things and we try many different policies, but at the end of the day, until we do the optimal thing, I mean, we are moving, like, you know, like there is a Pareto frontier that will be like the best that we can get. That will be like the optimal exploitation of fishes. And then if we do the optimal policy, we're going to go to that frontier. If we do something else, we always move around inside the frontier. And some people are better off, some people are worse off. There are going to be years that we exploit kind of in the optimal level and some years that we don't. I think that's there is a connection there, and I'm happy to think about that more. This connection between climate and fisheries. I find that interesting, actually. Well, the EU emission trading system, yeah, that you don't feel familiar with it. What was the other question? My inequality work. You know, this is a little bit, it's not an integrated assessment model in the sense that we are using a heterogeneous agents model. The integrated assessment model in Nordhaus spirit is like a global economy where there is a representative agent that will be like the medium consumer in the or the median citizen in the world. And if you want to think about inequality, social income inequality, then you need to think about people that are different. And that, in terms of the tools that you need to analyze, is a challenge. Usually, these models don't have like theoretical results as the ones that I like. You have to go into the computer and do quantitative assessments. So they do have, so the work has an externality, it has climate change, but the framework is not the one that I showed. It's one with heterogeneous agents where people differ on their productivity. And so some of them are low skill and some of them are high skill, and that translates into their labor income.
Well, we have 3 questions from Sebastian. Would you imagine to include global fisheries sector in the EU carbon emission scheme? And another one, encouraging other countries such as the US and China to join the mechanism. And what are the key topics that you think we could consider when linking public finances and equity, especially around the oceans?
The thing is that I don't know much. I would like to know more about fisheries. For sure, it's hard to answer, Sebastian, because I don't know the business much. So I know for sure that oceans play a role in the climate problem in terms of acting as a carbon sink. And so oceans health is important and can be included in a carbon trading scheme as a source of carbon offsets, right? Then I'm not sure how fisheries affect or whether they do or not, affect the ability of oceans to absorb carbon. If they do, then there is a direct link. I mean, if having overexploitation of fishes affect the health of the ocean in a way that the ocean is able to capture less carbon, then there is a direct link between the two problems. And for sure a role to add it into a carbon scheme, but maybe you can tell me about that if you know. And then the thing about linking public finance and equity, what is the equity problem? Maybe we can make of this a conversation. What is your institute? What is it called? Equal
Yeah,
C?
That is a good question, Elisa. Thanks a lot for the great presentation. First of all, in relation to my question, in relation to equity and public finance, for example, in global fisheries in the oceans, there is a huge debate right now because according to we don't have so much evidence right now, but there are some very sound papers that already demonstrate that is a huge inequality in the distribution of benefits that different countries or companies around the world that are benefiting from the oceans, right? And
I don't hear. Is it me?
Also other type of mechanism.
We lost you, Sebastián.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
¿Sí? ¿Se escucha bien ahora?
La última parte no se escuchó. Se escuchó de que that different countries benefit differently from the exploitation, I guess, of the oceans.
Yeah, sorry.
Now he's freezed again.
Yeah, he's changing for another computer, yes.
Sorry, Elisa. Thanks a lot for the present. No, I was just wondering whether how, for example, in the oceans, in the context of the ocean, we are now in Equal Sea. We are very interested to try to find connections between what type of public mechanism or financial mechanism, not only public but also private ones, that could potentially affect the distribution of benefits around the world, right? It benefits in terms of simply saying, for example, catch, right, distributed by countries, and there is a little evidence on that right now. But the evidence that they have been already demonstrating the scientific community, well, it is quite sound, and it shows that there is a strong mechanism, right? But the issue is that how we can, for example, design or mechanisms or better mechanisms to try to reduce those type of inequalities, not only in the form of how much, let's say, benefit the countries or companies extract from the oceans, for example, but how at national level, but how, for example, that could be better distributed through, let's say, communities or coastal zones around the world because of the, for example, because of the recent increasing of the global population localized in coastal zones, for example, right? So the link, we are very interested to learn more about your experience and your knowledge on what type of, let's say, key mechanisms from public finance you feel or you think that it should be or it could be recommended to move forward according to your experience you have in this topic, right? In linking public finance and equity.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that it must be related, and I guess some of it must be in place of like a property rights, right? So in terms of carbon emissions, we usually talk about this concept of the carbon budget. This is like how much carbon can we release from here until maybe 2030 or 2050. So how much can we release of carbon emissions and keep the temperature below the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees increase. And then there is a question of how this carbon budget, say we can pollute 10. So who is going to pollute those 10? So how we distribute that among different countries? And it looks to me that something similar is a problem that you are describing to me, where we have the ocean and there should be like an optimal amount of exploitation of the ocean. And then the question is how we allocate that among the different countries and maybe among the communities. And somehow the tool is always to assign a property right. So the problem with the ocean, the problem with the atmosphere is that kind of they are free, they are global, and then like everybody overuse the global, the common resource. And the way to solve that is to assign property rights on the good, which in this case would be the ocean. And I don't know how much of that is done. And I know there are like these platforms like close to the countries that, right? But I don't know the open sea. Is there any property right allocation on the open sea, or is it just open?
In the case of the high sea, for example, the open sea, it's just open,
yeah.
right? It's an international zone, let's say, right? It's
yeah.
for everyone, let's say. There are some regulation for sure, but there are some, let's say, what is called regional organizations. For example, close to Ecuador, for example, harvesting tuna, for example, which is quite well regulated. But there are a lot of, let's say, type of fisheries like the ones we have in the Southwest Atlantic in Argentina, for example, like squid, for example, or hake, which cross from our exclusive economic zones to the high sea, to the open sea, for example, which is badly regulated compared to the previous one.
Yeah, and I think, it's again, like if you think about in an optimal way, there must be something related to assigning property rights over the open sea too, like that. And the funny thing is that is a really like a well-studied problem, right? That when there is a common resource, there is over exploitation, but somehow we don't know how to solve it. Even though we know how to solve it, we still see that we don't know how to solve it, right?
Well, we have two questions left from Jill and Jose. Jill says, I was very interested in how you describe consumption as making us happy. This is maybe a philosophical question, but does consumption actually makes us happy? For a few days, perhaps until the next thing comes along. But in terms of the economy, does consumption have to be the main driver? Can there be a non-material driver such as human well-being that could be the focus on economic policy?
Yeah, I guess that's a nice question, and that points out that I'm an economist and I always think about consumption as the driver of social welfare, but it doesn't have to be. That's usually the way we think about the problem, and for sure, so some models have like a minimum amount of consumption, and so yeah, you could think that it's not the only thing, but for sure there is a minimum amount of consumption that you need in order to survive. So in that way, consumption always going to be there, but we can think that, okay, let's just keep the minimum, and like that's the subsistence level of consumption. And these models that I mentioned, that I described today, sometimes they have like a utility. So where welfare doesn't only come from consumption, but from other things, and that's that is called that is also modeled like a climate utility. And so maybe you get welfare from living in a nice environment, or you get welfare from health benefits from living in a nice environment, and that is added as part of the social welfare function. I didn't do it, but it's not that was me. Like, it's not that nobody does it. There are other arguments that can come into your utility function, and then you take that into account in the policy and design. Like, everything goes through, just that you take these other feedbacks into account.
Well, and the last question for now. Jose thanks you, Elisa, for the presentation, and he questions, in your experience, is there a willingness of companies or entrepreneurs to take up the challenge of limiting carbon emissions, or do they rather respond to emission policies? And additionally, can you differentiate this willingness between Latin American and other parts of the world?
Well, I'd say I don't know if I can differentiate between Latin America and other parts of the world, but I would say that the problem that we have in Latin America, maybe as Pablo was mentioning at the beginning, is that we have so many other problems that takes our energy and our time, that even though maybe we think about climate change as a problem, we also think that, well, I have to deal with 70% inflation, and so you cannot take care of everything at the same time in your own mind. So there are other things that for sure move the agenda to kind of more short-run problems, and that is true for Argentina and for many countries in Latin America. I do see, like as I said, more awareness from companies, and I work at a business school, and I see that coming all the time, and I see that in advertisement, and I think now they have moved into kind of marketing, sustainable marketing. They all want to show themselves that they are like a green and sustainable, and has been very very clear, like in like moving every ad that you see is just evoking something related to being a sustainable company. I think at the end of the day, that is just marketing until we actually see companies paying the cost of that. And that only comes from policies. And so, I mean, I do see it as a good thing, at least there is more awareness, but unless there is like this political will of moving ahead and just being aggressive with the policy, with climate policies, I don't see it's gonna make a change. In the same way for individuals, like I may want to bike like home so I don't drive, but I'm not gonna make much of a difference.
Well, I don't know if someone else want to make some comments or questions. That's all.
Well, I want to
No.
invite you again to the workshop. Maybe I'm going to send you, Sebastiana, maybe you can distribute the link, because I think it's going to be hybrid, that you will be able to follow the workshop in case there is some of the sessions that you are interested. Graciela Chichinetsky, I don't know if you know her, she's Argentina in Colombia. She's going to be talking about carbon offsets. And so that's going to be the keynote speaker. And maybe, I mean, the main thing would be if next year you want to participate and just give a talk to us, that would be awesome. Will be like a next step to collaborate. And for sure, since I heard Sebastian in the workshop, I want to know more about fisheries. And I see like a clear connection between my work and that. I'm not sure what can be done, but I'm sure there is an intersection in there. So if I can help in any way, if you're thinking about policies and this policy design, just let me know and we can talk.
Excellent. Thanks a lot again, Lisa. Very happy to have you with us. And sure, yes, please circulate the workshop, because I really enjoyed last year, and it was really creative and fruitful discussions. I really encourage all of us here to, if possible, to participate. We will be there for sure.
Very awesome. Awesome. Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me, for your time. Bye.
Thank you.
Gracias,
so much,
Elisa.
Elisa.
Un abrazo
De
grande.
nada. Estamos en contacto.
Dale, un abrazo.
Gracias, Elisa.
Un abrazo.